Okay, I think we're live. So, ladies and gentlemen, everybody who's joining us for this CyberPeace Institute webinar, welcome. We're going to host a series of webinars to talk about the infodemic that goes hand in hand with the coronavirus epidemic, and that is a real threat to cyberpeace. And we'll explain with a great panel today why it is so. For those of you who don't know us, at the CyberPeace Institute, we're committed to protecting vulnerable populations from the harms of cyber attacks, as well as the escalation of conflict in the digital world. And we use collaborative analysis of attacks to foster better public awareness, as well as to advance the agenda of responsible behavior and international norms. And the reason why we're so happy to welcome you today, and especially our excellent panel, is the urgency of the topic. I'm sure you, as all of us, are very focused and also fearful of what the coronavirus might bring. But unfortunately, there's also bad actors that are seeking to exploit exactly these fears. We heard the Director General of the World Health Organization saying that the spread of disinformation is faster than the spread of the coronavirus, but that this infodemic is at least as dangerous. So what we're going to do today in this webinar is exploring the spectrum between the harms of disinformation and how it relates to hybrid conflict and flat-out cyber conflict. We're going to dive into methods, motivations, different actors that may be involved, and putting what we see happening now in a historic context, such as what happened during other epidemics and also what we can learn going forward. We want to zoom in on how the massive lockdowns and unprecedented numbers of people at home, behind their computers, huge and historic levels of online activity may lead to more risk and a new space for attackers to exploit. How does this all develop and how can we prepare ourselves? The way in which we're going to conduct this webinar is as follows. I will, in a minute, briefly introduce our excellent speakers, but also give you a brief reminder before each speaker begins of who you are listening to. Each of our experts will share about 5 minutes of introductory remarks, and then we will go into a question and answer session where I will be asking questions. And we're very sorry that it doesn't allow for more interaction or questions coming in, but with the high number of participants that registered and the live streaming, we thought that this would actually be more manageable. And all of this will make sure that you'll be finished within 1 hour. I'm going to now introduce the 4 panelists we have for you today. We will first hear from Laura Rosenberger. She's the director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, as well as a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Washington. They work to document and expose foreign state actors' ongoing efforts to subvert democracy in the United States, in Europe, and globally. Before Laura joined the German Marshall Fund, she was a foreign policy advisor for the Hillary for America campaign, and she coordinated the development of the campaign's national security policy, messaging, and strategy. She's also held positions at the State Department and the White House's National Security Council. We will then move to Nathalie Fong. She's an associate analyst at the EUISS. She focuses primarily on the EU Cyber Direct project and supports cyber diplomacy. Her expertise is in cybersecurity, information warfare, but also the legal dimensions of these important topics. Then we will hear from Camille Francois. She is the Chief Innovation Officer at a company called Graphica, which is a social network mapping and analysis company that leverages the power of artificial intelligence to create detailed maps of the social media landscape. She's responsible for using innovative tools and data science to track and combat online disinformation, media manipulations, and harassment. And before that, she was at Jigsaw, which is a Google organization. And last but not least, our own CEO, Stéphane Duguin, with the CyberPeace Institute. But until last year, Stéphane was Senior Manager and Information Coordinator at Europol, the European Organization of Police Forces, where he set up the European Cybercrime Center and the Europol Innovation Lab, as well as the Internet Referral Unit within the Counterterrorism Center. So a lot of expertise. I'm very, very grateful that you were able to join us today amidst lockdowns and other measures that are undoubtedly shaking up your life as it is for the listeners and viewers today. But thank you for being with us, Laura. I would now like to pass over to you, and we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, thanks so much, Maricha and Stefan, and to the CyberPeace Institute for convening this really important conversation this morning. I know there's a lot of different dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic that people are concerned about, and I think it's really important to make sure that awareness of the, as you said, the infodemic that's happening alongside of this is something that we're not losing sight of. There's many different dimensions to this that you sort of previewed, Maricha, in your opening remarks, and I know other panelists are going to speak to a variety of the dimensions of this challenge. I'm going to focus my remarks this morning on an element that I've been looking at in detail over the past week, which is the way in which the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese party state has been manipulating information and, in fact, taking new steps in adopting new tactics, or at least experimenting with new tactics in its own information manipulation efforts around the virus. So just a little bit of background for some who may not be spending as much attention studying Chinese propaganda. The Chinese Communist Party, as it often does around internal crises, really started to ramp up its propaganda machine during the virus's initial outbreak in Wuhan. And in line with what we've seen it traditionally do, much of its early effort was focused on suppressing discussion of the virus itself. Most folks will have heard about the whistleblower doctor who tried to raise early alarms within China, and discussion of the virus from him and others of his colleagues was suppressed by the censorship apparatus within China. China, of course, then had its own very significant and massive outbreak, which it has since been able to bring under control. I think many people still have some questions about the official statistics we see from China, but evidence is that indeed the virus has been stemmed largely within the mainland of China. And so China has taken this opportunity to basically attempt to turn what was an internal failing of its initial response to cover up the virus initially, to suppress discussion of it, and turn that into an external success through a very robust information manipulation campaign, including with specific disinformation. So essentially, the effort has been aimed at trying to do two things. One, portray China as the actual superior model for how to respond to the virus. Two, to portray China as a reliable partner for others, in particular in Europe, to help stem the spread of the virus. And then third, to raise questions about whether, in fact, the virus really actually started in China. And I'll briefly walk through these three different elements. But the first piece of it, as I said, is really about portraying China as a model. And that's, I think in many ways, something that a lot of countries would do when they are trying to shape narratives externally. And we see a lot of sort of just traditional narrative shaping happening on social media, through accounts from their diplomats, through state media outlets. The second piece that we see is this China as a partner of sort of first resort. And it's really where we see aid shipments coming in from China to Europe, accompanied by very extensive propaganda efforts to talk about all the things that China and its entities are doing. So it's not just the Chinese government. We have large Chinese state-owned entities, state-owned enterprises, companies like Alibaba, companies like Huawei, also providing donations accompanied with very significant information fanfare. And the third piece that I want to spend a little bit more time on, because I just think it's a really important case study in how we see China's propaganda apparatus really evolving and taking lessons from Russia in this moment, is the spread of disinformation and conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus. In particular, China's foreign ministry spokesperson has been sharing pretty aggressively alternative explanations, including conspiracy theories from known conspiracy propaganda sites that have been traditionally seen as pro-Kremlin kind of conspiracy sites. China's foreign ministry spokesperson has been sharing these kinds of conspiracy theories, including allegations that the real origin of the virus was from a US Army bioweapons attack. And in a coordinated campaign last week, over a dozen of China's ambassadors shared the same article, either amplified or retweeted the content from China's foreign ministry spokesperson and the underlying allegations about the origin of the virus possibly not being from China, possibly being from a US bioweapons attack. And then in another turn of the crank over the weekend, China's Global Times, which is a state-backed, party state-backed media outlet, actually started spreading a conspiracy theory that maybe, in fact, the virus was actually originated in Italy. And so what we've seen in that case study is, I would say, two different new steps by the Chinese propaganda apparatus to adopt Russian tactics. One is using their ambassadors and state-backed media to spread conspiracy theories to deflect blame from China or Russia in their case about a particular event. And then two, in what I think is a potentially significant break from what many people had assessed to be a difference between China and Russia, is actually the spreading of these multiple explanations for what might have happened in an event. So it could have been a US bioweapons attack. It could have originated in Italy. It could have originated somewhere else. We can't possibly know the truth. There's too many different possibilities to know. This is something Russia has done after the MH17 shoot down, after the poisoning of Sergei Skripal. And many analysts had thought that this was a distinction between China and Russia's tactics, that Russia's focus was on sowing confusion and doubt and undermining the idea of truth. China was much more focused on narrative creation and control. And so I'll just sort of end on that point, is basically saying, I think there's still a lot of questions about what China is doing with its attempts to sow disinformation around the virus. But it's pretty clear that they are at least experimenting with new tactics and techniques that, in my mind, really don't bode well for the direction that we see large governments around the world adopting these tactics. I'll add one very final point, which is that, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, but as with so many other areas of disinformation, there are things that our own governments and that we in our own societies are doing that make ourselves more vulnerable to this. And so when we have US officials, for instance, using xenophobic tropes around the virus, when we have them covering up data or sending conflicting reports and disinformation themselves, it only makes us more vulnerable and creates a greater opportunity for those external actors that want to manipulate things. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was Laura, the director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy with the German Marshall Fund. Thank you for your introduction. We'll now move to Nathalie Van Raamdonk, who is at ISS. Nathalie, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Marietje, and thank you for organizing this. I think it's very relevant to discuss this right now, and I think Laura gave a good view of how disinformation space is being abused. And I'm happy that CyberPeace Institute decided to focus also on how it affects the security of the internet itself. Because what we've seen in the last few weeks is not only disinformation being pushed out to destabilize democracies, to destabilize trust in authorities, but also that being used to attack and to abuse the digital space that we're all now operating in far more heavily, now that we all have to work from home. So what we've seen is a lot of criminals abusing this search for information, this need for more knowledge in what is happening, and this confusion over all these bullets going in every possible direction, and abusing this a lot by phishing. So disinformation as a phishing lure is exponentially growing in the past few weeks. And it's abusing this trusted authorities. So a lot of the phishing emails are purportedly coming from the World Health Organization. They're coming from national health authorities. They're coming from the CDC. And they're all, using the same tactic of planting malware or phishing for credentials. Some are even asking for Bitcoin donations to find a vaccination for the CDC, which is quite remarkable. since no government will ever use Bitcoin for these purposes, of course. But it's happening in so many different directions that this infodemic is targeting those who want more reliable information. We've even seen the Johns Hopkins mapping that is used a lot to see where the infections are arising. We've seen a malware replicant of this website, and it's terrible how people working from home right now are being targeted with this, because a lot of these systems have been set up quite rapidly. We've all been caught in speed, and in this way, a lot of these systems are actually abused against us. A way to fight the virus to stay home is actually now a way to infiltrate an organization more easily. And this isn't just done by criminals. We're seeing a lot of nation-state operations in the last few weeks. One remarkable example has been how Russia has been using COVID-19 as a threat multiplier in Ukraine. So Ukraine already has quite a mistrust in its national healthcare services. And one of the APT advanced persistent threat groups, Hades, has been seen to launch disinformation in Ukraine, also using phishing as a lure. So there have been emails purportedly sent by the Ministry of Health in Ukraine. This was in mid-February, when there weren't a lot of cases yet in Ukraine, saying that there are new cases arising. And it didn't just cause disinformation. It didn't just create more malware in these spaces and exploit those vulnerable. It even caused riots. People went to the airports where people evacuated from China. Ukrainians were rioting against the arrival of these people. So there's been Russia using this space and abusing the disinformation. And China has actually also been doing this. So not only have they been pushing out disinformation and sowing chaos, in the last 2 weeks, we've also seen operations, I mean, purportedly from Chinese groups, one called Mustang Panda, using emails from the Vietnamese Prime Minister, well, allegedly from the Vietnamese Prime Minister in Vietnam, from Mongolian authorities in Mongolia, all bringing malware, installing backdoors. So there's been Russia, China, and North Korea, of course, who use South Korean vulnerabilities, launching phishing operations with South Korean information from the health authorities. So these have been the nation-state operations we've seen. Other states have abused the disinformation space, also like Iran, who have not only launched disinformation as if it's been a Western-backed biological weapon against Iran, but who have also launched spyware against their own citizens. So these have been apps asked to the population to install to check if they would have symptoms, but it's actually been spyware that has been tracking their citizens' movement. So abusing the pandemic to install more tracking opportunities. And this is the last thing I think that is quite concerning, in the way in which this infodemic is being abused to create more surveillance possibilities. In this situation, everything seems proportionate compared to our national privacy, our national security. And so, for example, Israel has now approved its secret services to track not just infected, but people who came into contact with infected. And the NSO group, which is a notorious surveillance organization, who was allegedly involved in the murder of the Saudi journalist Khashoggi. NSO group has also been trying to sell their surveillance technology for a civilian purpose. So these are quite concerning side effects of this disinformation and reasons to launch even more of an infodemic on society. So I'll leave it at that. We can discuss further, but this is where the nexus between the two lies.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. Nathalie Van Raamdonk with the EU ISS. That was very clear, and we'll come back to some questions to follow up. I would now like to move to Camille Francois with Graphica, who will share her introductory remarks. Thanks, Camille.
Thanks again for hosting us and for hosting this important conversation. I'll just try to be brief and complimentary. I wanted to start with sort of the backdrop on which all of this is happening from an information environment perspective. So at Graphica, we've been looking at this conversation around COVID-19 and how it's been evolving since January on a global scale. And I'll first start by admitting that we do see a large amount of related mis and disinformation, and by explaining a little bit the types of mis and disinformation that we see. The first one, of course, is a lot of inaccurate and misleading medical information that's quite viral, advice that has not been approved by any form of medical authority. There's a lot of appetite for that circulates really quickly. We see a lot of anti-immigrant and racist narratives that are very close to COVID-19. We, of course, see a lot of conspiracy theories. As Laura pointed, a lot of that focuses on the origin of the pandemic and sort of the creation myth around it. And finally, I think that translates into a lot of what we call homebrew trackers and homebrew maps. This is happening in an environment in which people have a distrust of public data, and a lot of what we're seeing is people making their own trackers and their own maps. Since we started looking at this in January, we've generally seen the amount of mis and disinformation around this increase. I think the platforms are now stepping up and really doubling down to make sure that a lot of this harmful information gets moderated. I will also say we do see this on a global scale, although with very interesting regional differences. And so, for instance, when you look at the overall pattern of conversation around COVID-19 in the US, you can also clearly see that most of this is currently being dominated by conservative groups whose share of voice in the conversation is much larger. That's also a trend that's true in what we see in Italy, where we see conservative groups leading that conversation. And it's not the case for most of the EU countries that we study. So that's sort of like the backdrop of this is the environment in which we're currently living. The other thing, of course, is the crisis is a time of great tension. And when we think of information operation, we should always keep in mind that tensions are the breeding ground of IO, and that the most state actors who are deploying information operations, their primary goal is to divide and weaken, right? When we have tensions between different groups, when we have tensions between countries, between political leaders, they will come and look for cracks in social cohesion to exploit, divides to weaken, and tensions to heighten, right? Tensions are really sort of what feeds information operation. So with all that in mind, I will say there is a real threat that we are going to see an increased amount of innovative information operations by state actors and by sort of the for-hire market that has formed around this information operation. I think Laura covered well what we're already seeing and what we can expect from China. Sorry, I'm going to mute the applications in the background. Webinar learnings. And when we think about Russia, I also want to highlight that there is a long tradition of Russian actors in disinformation exploiting infectious diseases as a core narrative, right? This is not something new. This is something that we've seen them do around AIDS, around dengue fever, around malaria. Infectious disease in general historically have proven and provided important hooks for information operations to focus on. So we can expect this from Russia, and again, as we said, from other actors who we've seen active in this space, Iran, Saudi Arabia, along with all the for-hire industry. Now, what this means is, for people who routinely focus on information operations, we continue to see and to uncover and to mitigate information operations that are focused on influencing different audiences. Our team worked on exposing a Russian operation that was conducted through Ghana. That was about 2 weeks ago, and so that's the other thing that we should keep in mind is this world of information operations focusing on manipulating audiences, manipulating elections is going to continue happening in the background, right? The more we have uncertainty, for instance, around whether elections should be held, whether it is safe to go and vote, whether things should be rescheduled, the more we'll have actors who continue to exploit these divisive narratives and questions to continue the work that we've seen them do. That being said, I also want to highlight that it's important for us to keep the work that has started and keep our sort of calms and standard of rigor of investigating when that happens. A lot of what we're seeing, at least on the Graphica side, is people who are starting to see information operations everywhere, and people who are starting to see Russia and another series of threat actor behind every conspiracy that they see online. The last thing we investigated, for instance, when we looked at SMS-based disinformation, a lot of people suspect that these are tactics that come from foreign actors. More often than not, when we investigate these types of tactics, what we see is domestic pranksters who sort of organize to prank their friends on the internet and create videos around it, right? So we need to keep in mind that not everything is going to be an information operation. And this is also a time where we need people to feel safe to use the internet to organize, to use the internet to keep themselves informed, to use the internet to do these networks of solidarity that we direly need and that sort of represent the best that the online public sphere has to offer at this time. So a note of caution on both, like, it is true the threat is real, but let's make sure that we don't overreact to it and don't throw the baby with the bathwater, as we say in France.
Thanks, Camille. Camille Francois with Graphica, you just heard. And now we're switching to the CEO of the CyberPeace Institute, Stéphane Dugan.
Thank you, Marichi, and thank you for the other panelists that accepted to join us in such a short notice. I appreciate it, and already very insightful comments that you provided. I would like to build on what you were mentioning before, trying to put this into the context of what happened in the past, what is happening now. I mean, did we learn anything about the past, and then what are we going to do next? And Nathalie mentioned a lot of examples when it comes to ongoing malicious activities from very different actors, and Laura and Camille also touched upon this. If you look in the past, what happened in other pandemics or other very tragic events that had a global, let's say, global scale emotional response. So you would see like the Charlie Hebdo attack, when there was malicious activity around hijacking hashtag in order to vectorize attack, in order to provide some malware to people that would be normally sympathetic with what was happening. You see what was happening in the context of the outbreak of Ebola, or the context of outbreak in Zika. Same, there was impersonation of WHO, people receiving emails allegedly from CNN, from telecommunication agencies, in order to make them click on attachments and then download malware for very various reasons. And at that time already, there was this two kind of family of attack, the one that were clearly coming from criminal groups, because going after data or going after money, and also attacks going from state actors that were going into these manipulation schemes that Laura, Nathalie, and Camille just described. How is this different today? I mean, you would imagine Ebola was 2014-15, Zika 15-16, and it looks like we are still facing exactly the same modus operandi, and we are already again talking about what can we do about this. So something that already we could have in mind in the context of this crisis is, what did we not learn from the past one? So what is it that we missed as a collective, as a society, and also in terms of the whole service provider that allow us to access these services, to be resilient in this kind of context? Because today, the modus operandi are quite similar. If you look at the normal modus operandi for cyber attacks, they are all happening these days. For the past week, there's been an explosion when it comes to domain registration with names that are in relation with the coronavirus and COVID-19. You can even see that after just after the date when WHO communicated about COVID-19 as a name, then suddenly there was a rise and a spike in purchase in domain name related to that. So that modus operandi is very old. It's happening, and yeah, it's there. We just look into it. Something else that is linked also with the modus operandi of large-scale cyber attacks being by state or non-state actors is how this creates and generates additional activities in forum and in space where cyber criminals and attackers are exchanging tips or tools, or are putting in place the well-known cybercrime as a service model. One of these places is the darknet or specific forum on the darknet. And today you could see special offers like a discount, like you have the Black Friday, etc. No, it's like discount coronavirus special. In order to get your discount, if you want to buy this malware or this weaponized map that would normally show you how the virus is spreading, then you can get that map, send it to someone, and when someone is going to click, is going to be infected. So these trends are the same, happening again. So really the question would be, what should we learn now from what is happening, both as communities and also as individuals? I will close there because I would like to leave all the space for the question and answer. But I will close with two thoughts. The first one is, individually, we all have a responsibility, meaning all of us. The best practices when it comes to defend ourselves on large-scale disinformation that in fact are just accelerating cyber attacks are quite, for 99% of them, really simple. It's about investigating what you receive, don't click on anything. Most importantly, don't spread. It's quite funny that you think what is given to us as advice today in order to safeguard the most vulnerable people in the real world is exactly the same as the online world. If you don't spread something that you have no clue about to someone else just for the laugh or for the curiosity, already you stop a just simple vectors of moving an attack. Don't spread and report. It's important also that to report, and I go back to what Camille touched upon, is do we really know what is happening? I mean, we see some bits and pieces of data left and right, some reports, so many domains, so many malware. 30U was explaining in a very good report that there's now 25 malware family in the wild linked to COVID-19. It would be good to aggregate this data so we can have an evidence-led response to what is happening. So we really know what is happening, what were the actors, what are the tools, and how to best have a collective response to this, but based on data, based on facts. And I will stop there, Marie-Cho, in order to give the floor to questions.
Thank you so much, Stéphane Duguin, the CEO of the CyberPeace Institute. Thank you all. I think those were very, very helpful introductions. And I now want to come back with some questions, and I'll do it in the same order as in which the introductions were given. So, Laura, I wanted to come back to you and especially pick up on the first part of your introduction, which is about Chinese parties, could be companies, could be state entities now providing help to all kinds of places in the world, and how that relates to the infodemic. Because some people might say, well, isn't it nice of the Chinese authorities to help out people in this emergency? And so it would be helpful if you could dig a little bit deeper into where very legitimate and helpful activities may be distorted by information, or maybe part of a broader agenda that people at home, when they're watching the news and seeing, for example, facial masks being delivered from China, may not understand to be related to an infodemic at all.
I think it's a great question, Richa, and I just want to, again, thank you for pulling this all together. I learned a lot just listening to the other panelists as well, so this is a really great lineup. So I think it's a great question, because you're absolutely right. The provision of aid and things like masks and sending medical help, all of these things are really important and legitimate activities in a crisis. And it's really wonderful that a country like China that has overcome its early mistakes in its handling of the virus and has been able to, at least for the moment, get things under control internally, is providing that kind of assistance to others. And with so many countries in desperate need of these kinds of this kind of assistance, whether in terms of goods or actual personnel, that is a very good thing, and we should distinguish that from the information campaigns that are coming alongside of it. And the reason that I think that that's important, but I think it has to be understood the way that China is using these information campaigns to try to twist the aid that's being provided, right? Because rewinding the tape, just a second, much of China's goal with its external propaganda and its external assistance right now is to continue to rewrite the narrative of how the Chinese Communist Party handled the virus and how it responded. And so to sort of suppress this discussion of its original missteps and instead portray China as the real power that is the only one that knows how to handle this. It's the only one that knows how to provide this kind of assistance. And this kind of, information, I would call this sort of information coercion. I'd point folks, there's a really good paper, if people aren't familiar with some of this, the literature around these issues. People may hear things like goods provisions and information that's promoting it as simply being about soft power, that kind of the power of attraction, as Joe and I described it. And there was a really good paper from the National Endowment for Democracy and some very thoughtful folks there a couple years ago to describe the distinction between soft power and what they call sharp power, which is a much more coercive and manipulative kind of the exercise of power, in particular in the information space. And I think that what we're seeing now is a real example of the distinction between sharp power and soft power, that this isn't just the provision of goods, this is the provision of aid in a way that is to coerce, to manipulate, to try to somehow portray a different kind of narrative than what is in fact the truth. And so I think that this is a case study in sharp power is a really interesting and important one to look at. The last piece that I would say on this is that all of this is taking place against the backdrop of what has been an effort in CCP propaganda, Chinese Communist Party propaganda, to create the impression of a divide between the US and Europe. And of course, with the Trump administration, there has in fact been some divisions between the US and Europe and some challenges in the transatlantic alliance. And the CCP propaganda has really sought to capitalize on that to drive this idea that the US is not a reliable partner for Europe, that in fact China and companies like Huawei providing 5G, all that, they are the true reliable partner for Europe. And that Europe should instead be turning to China and not to the US. And so this is an ongoing narrative arc that we've been seeing from CCP propaganda as well. And again, the efforts we see in this moment around COVID-19 is really aimed at bolstering that narrative through examples happening right now.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful clarification. Nathalie, you talked a lot about the exploitation of mistrust, but also of people at home that are hungry for information. And you also mentioned the question of phishing. And I think that a lot of people who are watching at home now could be afraid and could learn from how they themselves can avoid being the victims of phishing attacks, because I think it's one of the lowest thresholds where everybody can help be more resilient and also avoid being scammed or the victim of fraudulent efforts. So if you could share a little bit more about the tactics and the way in which people at home can prepare themselves, I think that would be very helpful.
Thanks, Malicious. So phishing is a technique that it's said to be 95% of all cyber intrusions use phishing as a vector of intrusion. So this isn't just a problem for COVID-19. It is just very handy during COVID-19 that people are a lot more receptive to the message in phishing. Phishing messages always come with an urgency. They always give off the illusion of authority. That's why I mentioned the abuse of distrust in information sources like the WHO. It's quite bright if you think about it. Because we're all so hungry for this kind of knowledge. And a lot of national authorities are sending out alerts via email as well. I've received one as well from my national crisis center. So it's difficult for people to know what is real and what is not in this snap decision that we need to make. But they always, as we always say, stop before you click and think about it. Especially with emails that ask for a credential. Would the WHO ask for a credential? Would they actually send an attachment? And then there's a few things that you can do also as an organization to help people who might be clicking on phishing links. For example, some of these documents that contain malware, they're Word documents or Office documents that have a macro in it. And you see this when you open these documents. It has this little yellow bar that says, "Are you sure you want to open this or keep it on read only?" from the moment you open that, you open the macro as well. And that's how you actually take in that malware. So these are a few things that you need to think about once you are taking those steps to think, would they actually send this to me? Would I actually receive this attachment? Should I actually open this? And the best thing you can do if you're in doubt, which you should always be, is to just go to the page of such an organization. Don't click on the link of the page, but go to it directly to see if that information is replicated there as well, or call them. What happens now a lot as well is email addresses get spoofed from the CEO or the director, saying like, oh, this is urgent, immediate request for payment. We're all working from home now. A lot of people don't have that mechanism of calling their organization. They're used to just like swaying by the office and having a second, ask. This isn't really the case with these work from home solutions. So a lot of the advice that we always give with phishing is definitely applicable here. Be alert, be aware of what you get in, and also be very aware of the fact that everybody is a vector. If you are just the administrative assistant, you're actually a very important vector in an organization. If you get infected and then your email address sends to everyone else the next infection, your entire organization is compromised.
Thank you, Nathalie. I think that was very clear and also empowering for people that they can actually do something. Camille, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in your introductory remarks that actually medical emergencies or pandemics like this have been exploited in the past. And yet we've never seen a situation like we're in now, all of us all over the world in such a lockdown, so many people at home. And so it's led to, I think, almost a paradoxical set of developments, meaning more people are online than ever, all hungry for information, eager to keep up with the latest developments. And on the other hand, the risk that is itself leading to more confusion and false information being shared. So there's been a lot of pressure on the social media companies and the technology companies. And I was wondering whether you could say something about the scale. How big are these information flows? If you have data from the past, how do they compare? But also, what are we seeing companies doing, and is it helpful? What kind of interventions are they now engaging in that they also have not done in the past?
Thanks, Rashid. Those are a great set of questions. Yes, there's been a lot of pressure on social media companies. I think that pressure is warranted. I think we should keep it on, and I think so far it's been helpful. We have seen them take the threat pretty seriously and adapt to new ways to monitor the information environment. Now, that's difficult for many reasons. Of course, they are also affected by the restrictions in travel. So there's a lot of conversations around how do you do content moderation at scale in an environment in which some of your workers are not going to be able to commute to the facilities that they usually do that in. So there's a series of things for them to still work. But I think by and large, they've heard the pressure and we see them respond to it. To your point around, it's the first time, and yet we've seen bits and pieces of this before. I really, like Stefan's call to just read history and demand and share evidence on previous operations and incidents in place, right? So something that comes to mind in terms of modern history of actors exploiting weaknesses here is going to be Thomas Reid's upcoming book on active measures that really focuses on specifically how Russia has systematically targeted including infectious diseases to spread disinformation and propaganda in the past. I think those sort of modern history are going to be very helpful. And if you look at more contemporary incidents, Laura's organization and mine maintain a small website that gives people access to recent information operations that have been detected and taken down by the platforms. It's called the Information Operations Archive. So if you go on io-archive.org, you can play with previous data. And to Stefan's point, if you look at, for instance, which actors have been engaging with Ebola when this was underway, you can already see that it has been a topic in Russian disinformation campaign, Iranian disinformation campaign, campaigns coming from Venezuela, coming from Bangladesh, right? So we already have a thin yet existing base of recent history of information operations that sort of teach us how those operations can go. Now, something that's quite challenging here is really the cross-platform nature of how disinformation is evolving, right? We see this happening on messaging. We see this happening on video. We see sort of like increasingly new tactics. And it's been hard for researchers, but also for the general audience, to keep up with how exactly would disinformation manifest if it were to cross one of my devices in one of the many websites that I use. I think here, a core advice that's really important for everybody is to really engage with authoritative voices who are actively trying to be more innovative in the way they communicate. So I, for instance, subscribe to the World Health Organization's WhatsApp feed. They have a great feed. You can simply text WHO, and then they have, you know, a set of emojis that you can send them to get the latest updates. I think that's wonderful. I want to see more organizations sort of embracing these new means of communicating. I also receive the New York City updates directly on SMS. I think making sure that authoritative voices can break through the noise and can reach platforms that they're usually not used to, and people where they are is really important. We should help them do that.
Thanks, Camille. And I think that prompts us very well for a question I wanted to ask Stefan, which is really to dissect for us a little bit more, with all your years of experience, the methods and perhaps the goals of different actors. So we can understand how criminals might exploit this moment to sell things that are in fact not working, but also to have more sophisticated, let's say, cybercrime on a more technical level, feeding in to people's devices through phishing or other methods. And there's been a lot of reference to the agendas that states might have. Some of it could be visible in the form of a narrative, but other activity might be more covert. Could you take us through that spectrum a little bit?
Thank you, Marietje, for the question. What we learned from the past decade when it comes to the cyber attacks / cybercrime modus operandi is that a know-how and a malicious knowledge that is in a lot of cases spearheading by state actors, at some point really fast comes into the hand of non-state actors. So what this kind of infodemic accelerating cyber attacks is also doing, it triggers extra capacity with the one that have a lot of resources to scale, make large campaign, trying to manipulate large number of people, and by manipulation then using this as a vector for attack. Seeing that these new methods that are like research and developed and put on the markets really fast, being used quite fast by criminals. So by doing this, we are just undermining the whole stability of the cyberspace. Because at the end of the day, it's just means and methods to be malicious that the state would use for a specific politically driven agenda. But in the end, a criminal group is going to use it in order for steal personal data, steal your financial credential, or just to disrupt a specific business entity for whatever financial means. So this whole vicious circle is what is really problematic now, because it's becoming accelerated by the fact that I'm a criminal or I'm a state actor. Now there's the opportunity for me to do at scale what was more complicated for me to do because there was not so much noise for me to hide in the middle. So and the noise word, it's Camille mentioned it before, is because at one end of the spectrum you have the actors that are trying to attack, and the other end of the spectrum you have the communities that are potential targets and potential victims. What we should look into is how to transform a potential victim into a co-creator of cyber resilience. Is that how can I be empowered as an internet user, especially now that everyone relies so much on the internet in order to work, manage the kids, etc. And not just what I'm going to do when I'm supposed to be targeted. The first hiccup that I see is there's already a lot of noise, a lot of messages everywhere. Trying to outreach to the population and to explain to them how to defend, how to understand the messages is really complicated because of the overdrive and overdose of information. I mean, I have the feeling that the people that are looking at us now, that are watching us now, are not the one that needs to be briefed in terms of, know-how and best practices cybersecurity. Because most of them, because of the interest of the topic that we're discussing into, are quite already on high level. How to reach out to the rest of the population with something that can be actionable. I receive, I understand, I act upon it, and I'm not a victim or potential victim anymore, but I'm an actor of a global community to increase resilience. And that's a tough one. There's something that we saw, and it goes to your question in terms of the modus operandi of criminals and state actors, is that when you have an action, you have a reaction. And we saw for the past days now, communities, self-generated communities that wants to help. So you have companies that are providing services, pay for services that are going to provide these services for free in order to unlock a system that are going to be ransomware or help citizens to defend themselves. But also other entities that would like to go even down to the line of investigation and trying to see, we are going to use our free time to find who the heck is trying to attack this hospital at the moment of a pandemic outbreak. So that's also something that we need to look into, is the increase of capacity in the criminal and state actors world is also now creating an increase of capacity and response as volunteers, as uncoordinated volunteers. That will be interesting to see if that scale and how this is going to change also the landscape, the cybersecurity landscape. I will just finish on one remark. Criminals and state actors only respond to something that is quite simple, that we can all understand, is accountability. If you can do something, and at the end of the day, there's no consequences, and you just can do it and do it again, and nothing is going to happen to you, we can discuss and we can have webinars until the end of days. There's not going to change a lot here. So we need to also use this momentum to investigate if the norms that we have, if the ecosystem of norms that we have is really put into action, is really put into operations. Because as long as state or non-state actors can benefit from something that tragic to scale up attacks on population for a financial gain, criminals, or political gain, state actors, and at the end of the day, even when we think or we can demonstrate that this is this actor, this one, there's no consequence, there's going to be the problem. So that's something that we need to look into.
Thanks, Stefan. And you will probably not be surprised that is actually something that we are very focused on at the CyberPeace Institute, what we call closing the accountability gap. And I wanted to end there because we have a few minutes left in our webinar. And I think one of the reasons why people may distrust authorities even more or feel disempowered is because they see so few consequences to some of these very, very invasive, very harmful criminal or state-to-state kinds of cyber attacks. And so I know this is sort of the million-dollar question, but still I would love to hear some thoughts from each of you briefly about how you think this accountability gap can be closed. What are the different elements that we have to put together? Laura, if I can come back to you for some final thoughts.
Thanks. I think it's a great place to end. I mean, from the perspective of the lens I take on these issues, which is largely thinking about how governments abuse information to sort of exert power and influence around the world. One of the most important things, I think, sorry, that's my dog in the background, making an appearance. One of the most important things that we can be doing as democratic nations is our governments working together as allies and partners to stand up against and forge joint responses to deal with those malicious foreign actors, whether that's the Iranian regime, Russia, China, North Korea, all of whom have been mentioned throughout the course of this webinar, engaging in either malicious cyber activity or malicious information activity. This is the time we need to be doing much more with our allies and partners to deal with the pandemic itself. And the same thing goes with the infodemic and the cyber, the cyber attacks as well. working together to put in place consequences and to trigger those consequences in coordination with our allies and partners is a really important piece of this. So there's a normative aspect to that, and Maricha, I know you've done a lot of work around the norms and governance issues around cyber tools, and then enforcing those is one of the most important pieces of actually making sure they stick. And so that has to be done multilaterally. That has to be done amongst like-minded governments. And it's not to say I think there's a panacea there. We could have a long conversation about the challenges and unlikelihood of deterrence in this space. But I do think that there is some utility to taking some of those steps in coordination. And so I certainly would like to see much more of that happening.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks for all your contributions today. Nathalie, your thoughts on the accountability gap and how we can close it?
Very good question. I think we've been working on this for a long time with the whole norms process. Do we need more laws? Do we need more rules? We already have international law. I had a brief moment where I said, oh, this attack on the Czech hospital, isn't that a breach of IHL? But then I was reminded we're not actually at war, even though Macron says we are. But it's one of those problems of, yes, we have international law, we have criminal law, but attribution. I keep saying, oh, the Russians did this and the Chinese did this, but did they really? And it's one of the main issues that we always talk about when it comes to accountability. Can we actually put consequences to this kind of behavior? And I think that the best consequence is always to find specific individuals and hackers who have undertaken these type of operations and not necessarily target countries in the first place. So I think putting more of our energy on law enforcement and tracking down these criminals is a first step. The normative element for states is of course the second step. And what I thought was interesting in the past few weeks was that there's also been an attempt at creating some moral responsibility with criminals, where some journalists have asked cybercrime groups, can you please not attack any medical facilities? And 2 cybercrime groups have responded to a journalist's question saying, okay, we'll create a discount if any hospitals have been targeted.
Crazy, yeah.
Yeah. So criminals don't have morals is what I'm basically trying to say. So all we can do is force and empower our law enforcement capabilities.
Thank you, and thank you for your contributions. Camille, your thoughts? Yeah, I agree with both Nathalie and Laura here. We've had very long and very productive in some ways debate around what bodies of law best apply to different types of cyber operations and criminal activity in cyberspace that we're observing. And I think at the end of that process, it comes clear that between criminal law, human rights law, international humanitarian law, there are a series of rules that can effectively be applied. But here, what's really at stake is the rigor and transparent assessments, the ability to share that information, and the ability to put the political will behind it. I will say there are a few emerging cases in which complex information operations targeted at specific countries have been investigated, publicly discussed, and have some form of consequences seem to have been applied. And I think we should think through those best practices and what we've learned. In the US, for instance, there's an interesting use case around what happened in the midterms in 2018, where we really saw government and the platforms and sort of the rest of society come together to rapidly investigate and mitigate and then respond to an ongoing threat of information operation. And again, I think there's a lot of emerging, small, scattered best practices in our very recent history that I hope we can quickly document and learn from.
Thank you so much, Stefan. I'm going to ask you to hold your thoughts, not to cut you off, but we are running out of time. And the good news is we are going to be doing a series of these webinars. And so I trust that we can have Stefan pick up where we're leaving today, which is the perpetual question of how we're going to create more accountability. And at the CyberPeace Institute, we believe that it involves a focus on getting an evidence-based understanding of what these attacks are, the methods used, the actors involved, but we also take a very strong focus on the victims. We think that the cyber is about people, and that especially vulnerable communities, whether it is patients in hospitals now or in other days, whether it's human rights defenders, whether it's journalists, people who are the victims of these attacks and manipulations are really at the core of our focus. And so we will continue to invite you for webinars, and we hope that you'll continue to join us online, even if there's more freedom of movement to meet each other in real life as well. And of course, I hope you'll be safe and healthy until then. Thank you so much for joining us, especially to our panelists. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. And
Thank
be
you.
safe.
Welcome.
Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.